sheer brutality of these murders earmark them as something different.
We couldn't believe that the injuries could have been done by somebody of sane mind.
They weren't satisfied with killing them. They had to torture them.
Somewhere in this country at the moment there is a serial murder being reenacted.
Two years before the end of the Second World War, a quiet, bespectacled man began strangling women in his kitchen. He lived at 10 Rillington Place, and his name was John Reginald Halliday Christie.
Christie was at one and the same time a vilely filthy man, his house was full of bed bugs and it stank to high heaven, and a fussy, pernickety, fastidious man who loathed the idea of having to see the excreta of his victims. So he took to taking old vests or pyjama jackets of his own, wrapping them between his victims' legs before he strangled them so that he wouldn't have to see this evacuation.
My mother's uncle said to me on one occasion that Christie was a bad man. He digs big holes in the garden late at night.
Christie? That's how I think of him now, Christie, just Christie. Goes right through me. See what lucky escape I had.
In the 1940s, Rillington Place was a small dead-end street to the west of London's Notting Hill.
It was a very poor area. After the war, it began to deteriorate. The houses got that much older, of course. The bombing shook the houses and so on, so that they weren't as smart as they used to be. There was 20 houses, 10 on each side. There was usually 3 families in each house.
The last house on the left was number 10.
My mother's uncle moved into the top flat while Christie was living there. It was a very eerie type of house. There was no electricity in it, there was only gas. In most of the houses you lit the gas so that you could see your way to the stairs, but they never had a light anywhere. I can remember the Christie opening his kitchen door once, sort of looking at it, and I said, "It's only me, Mr. Christie," and he shut it again.
Well, he just seemed to keep himself to himself, really. You know, you didn't see him an awful lot of the time. And we just thought that he and his wife were a nice couple.
I can remember talking to him one day, and he said he'd been in the police, a special policeman or something.
Special constables, well, they were called war reserves, were employed to fill the gaps made by police officers leaving and going to war.
He was a man who had made his way up as a not very successful clerk through quite a lot of petty crime, and he enjoyed the authority of being a policeman.
But towards the end of 1943, Christie faced the loss of this authority when he was discovered with the wife of a serviceman.
Serviceman comes back home, beats up Christie, registers a complaint about him. He's going to be kicked out of the special police. What he's admired most about himself in his life is collapsing around him.
For the criminal psychologists, criminologists who study the minds of serial killers, this event triggered Christie's killing spree.
With serial killers, there is often some final defining event that is associated with subsequent killing. There are, if you like, trigger circumstances, but they are triggered after the predisposing background is provided.
Serial killers will start killing generally towards the end of a cycle, and that cycle will start in pre-adolescence. I mean, in the research I've done, I found that the fantasies that begin to motivate a person towards homicide start as young as 6, 8, and 10 years of age.
He did have a father who despised him as not a manly little boy. His first known sexual experience was a disaster. Christie was unable to perform. Well, nerves when you're 14, 15, perfectly understandable. But the girl told everyone, and people jeered at him about this in the streets. So sex was something which he certainly thought was bad. It led to humiliation, and yet he wanted it.
You have a person who will almost certainly feel cheated, a person who is not receiving what he believes is his due. His sexuality is going to be an issue for him.
And after losing his specials commission, Christie began to spend more and more time in the company of prostitutes.
At night, he was sneaking around in plimsolls so that he could move silently, going to cafes, picking up prostitutes.
My parents used to go to the Royalty across the road, the pictures, and they'd come home about 10:30 and they'd meet him going out. And they'd say good evening and that, and he'd say, I'm just going out to get the cats some food. Well, I mean, there was no way that there were shops open in those days at 10 or 11 o'clock at night.
It was on one of these nighttime visits Christie became reacquainted with a part-time prostitute called Ruth First. When he was a special, he'd given Ruth rent money. Now he invited her round for tea.
He took her back to his home. He strangled her. He then hid her under his floorboards that night. He'd got his flat to himself because his wife was away. And the following day, pleading sickness and staying off work, buried it in the garden. That was body number 1 in 10 Rillington Place.
A year later, Christie killed again. 31-year-old Muriel Eady complained to Christie of bad sinusitis.
He claimed to have medical skills, and he invited her to come round to his flat at a time when his wife was out for some treatment. Basically, he offered her an inhaler. A glass jar with a screw-top lid, 2 rubber tubes coming out, and through one of them she inhaled what appeared to be Friar's balsam. The other tube led to a gas tap, and once the gas had rendered her unconscious, he raped her, then he strangled her.
With Christie, it's important in the murders that the woman is inert, that she's passive, and that he can make her, in his mind, whatever it is he wants her to be.
Christie now had 2 bodies buried in the garden.
Between 2 homicides, there is an emotional cooling down, an equilibrium, if you will, where they come back to a normal state. And that's kind of constant, but then builds up again slowly to the point where the emotion drives them to the next homicide.
However strong Christie's murderous drive may have been, it would be 5 years before there would be the opportunity to kill again. But he never stopped looking.
My husband was out in India, been out there 3 years. I needed the flat because the war was coming to an end. Anyway, I don't know who gave me that address at Sloane Square, or whether I found it in the South London Press. I thought, well, I'll try. Couldn't find the street, and that's when he came. He was naturally taller than me, slimmer. He was wearing these caps that they wear, special constable. Very polite, very nice. That's when he said, let's have a look at the address. Hey, you don't want to go there. It is the most terrible street. Come and walk round with you. He said, we'll look in the shops. And that's when he asked my name and address.
For 50 years, Peggy Baker has refused to talk publicly about her near escape, only telling the story to her immediate family.
It was about 2 days after that, I got this postcard. It said, have found you a flat you will like. Meet me, Sloane Square. I couldn't get there because I was working. When I saw it in the paper, I thought, that is him. That's him. Goes right through me. See what lucky escape I had.
But there would be no lucky escape for 19-year-old Beryl Evans. In 1949, Beryl moved into 10 Rillington Place with her husband Timothy and their baby daughter Geraldine.
Mrs. Evans came to my house at 18 to collect the key, because we got the key, still got the key for the house, and she said she was moving into the top flat. And she got Geraldine in her arms at the time.
Beryl was pregnant and expecting another child, and she wanted to get rid of it. Evans had been brought up a Catholic, though he wasn't a practicing Catholic. For whatever reasons, he disapproved and didn't want her to get rid of the child.
I think they had quite a lot of rows and one thing and another, so I heard from different neighbours.
Abortion was illegal. There was the Abortion Act, which prohibited abortion. But of course, like all these things, that there were people who were willing to do illegal abortions, and there had been people who died, many people died through illegal abortions.
It appears that Christie offered an abortion for Beryl. Evans went out to work one day, and when he got home in the evening, Christie met him at the foot of the stairs and said, "It's bad news, it didn't work." Beryl Evans was lying dead on her bed in the upstairs flat.
Evans, afraid he would be implicated in the crime, helped Christie hide the body. And on Christie's recommendation, he then left London for his native Wales, leaving his baby daughter behind in Christie's care. But Evans was consumed with guilt over the abortion and blamed himself for Beryl's death. Within weeks, he'd confessed to the murder.
It was awful, yes. And I mean, we couldn't imagine that her husband had done that. We couldn't imagine that, when she was pregnant as well.
In a search of the house, they found Beryl Evans and baby Geraldine hidden in that tiny wash house.
Both had been strangled, the same method Christie had used to kill Ruth First and Muriel Eady. As soon as Evans heard his daughter had also been killed, he changed his plea to not guilty.
By the time he came to his trial and accused Christie, it was too late. Christie denied everything. Nobody knew. Christie had 2 bodies down in the garden already.
They used to think, fancy trying to blame Mr. Christie. That wasn't fair. That I think we all thought that Evans had, Timothy Evans had done it.
Far from being treated as the villain, Christie was the main prosecution witness at the trial.
When he testified against Timothy Evans, it was a triple banger for him. Number one, he got to take the stand and be the center of attention. Very important. Number two, an innocent person was being convicted for his crime. And number three, he got to testify in a case for which he was responsible, and no one could associate him with a crime. So for those 3 reasons, it had to be extremely exciting for him to be on the stand and participate as he did.
The jury was totally taken in by Christie's performance. It would be 16 years before Evans' innocence would be recognised. By then, it would be too late. Evans was executed for murder in March 1950. 2 years later, Ethel Christie disappeared. By December 1952, the neighbours noticed that Reg Christie was living alone in the ground floor flat at 10 Rillington Place.
I remember meeting him and saying to him, I hadn't seen Mrs. Christie, is she all right? He said, oh yes, he said, she's staying with her sister for a while in Birmingham.
We were standing on Ladbroke Grove Station and Mr. Christie was on the platform. Mum got talking to him. Oh, how's your wife? She said, I haven't seen her for a while. Oh, he said, one of her family's not well. She's gone back home to Sheffield. All the time she was dead under the floorboards.
In the late autumn of 1952, Christie murdered his wife. Used his usual method, strangled her, and he put her down under the floorboards in his sitting room where he had previously put the body of Ruth First.
Christie later claimed that he had woken up one night to find his wife had taken an overdose and was choking to death. He claimed he could not bear to see her suffering, so he strangled her. But the criminologists see a much more straightforward scenario.
Sometimes people will get in the way of their crimes and become a danger to them, and of course those people have to be eliminated.
With Ethel out of the way, Christie could continue with his other murders. In less than a month, he was offering to carry out an abortion for his next victim. Rita Nelson was 6 months pregnant when she met Christie.
He used the gas tube to put her out. He ravished her in the deck chair and then strangled her, diapered her, put her into the coal cellar.
The method of killing was the same as for the first 3 victims. It is what the experts call a serial killer's signature.
Signature normally refers to behaviour that was carried out by the perpetrator at a crime that is more than was necessary to carry out the act itself. And if you are looking at serial killings, then the notion, I think, is fairly straightforward, that you are going to see this signature repeated.
The signature is carried out in a ritualistic, kind of a compulsive fashion because it's the basis of why they're doing this crime.
Christie's next victim was another prostitute, Kathleen Maloney.
He gets this drunk girl to sit down in the chair. He takes a tube from the gas tap, releases gas under her nose, just enough to make her pass right out, and he has his wicked way with her.
The signature was identical. The body was diapered and put into the coal cellar next to Rita Nelson's.
You have a man who has to yield to an urge. He does what he does with the killing, and then he's left with a problem. So he keeps it in the cupboard, he puts it under the floor, whatever it happens to be. He's going to deal with it at some point. But the need is still there.
But now the periods between the killings were getting shorter and shorter. It had been just days between this and Rita's murder.
The reason that their cooling off period shortens is because the more they get into homicide, the more mentally invested they are, to the point where they're putting everything aside for their crimes.
Clearly, Christie had lost control. He'd got his wife buried under his floorboards. He gave up his job and was now acting totally recklessly and thoughtlessly. He met a girl called Hectorina McLennan. He took her back to 10 Rillington Place and went through the same routine. He then set to work with some wallpaper and paste to paper over the door to the alcove where he'd now got these 3 bodies stored.
You reach a point where the crowding becomes a problem. The closer you are then to other people, the greater the risk of discovery. So that becomes a stressor in itself. This is exactly what happened with Christie. He fled the place that he lived to, as it were, get away with it all and start somewhere else.
But before he could start again, the flat's new tenant uncovered Christie's gruesome secret.
He was looking for somewhere to fix the aerial and found to his surprise that what appeared to be a solid wall was hollow wood. So he tore the paper to see what was inside, flashed a torch in, and saw 3 bodies stacked up against the wall. Just screamed and ran for the police.
He came running into the street and he said, 3 dead bodies or something or other. He was shouting and hysterical. So, of course, that started it off, the search.
They came home from school and there was all these people, all these cars and photographers and that there. And I went in and said to Mum, well, you know, what all the people doing out there and that, and she told me, you know, that they'd found some bodies in number 10.
It wasn't fully realised, in the first instance, that there were more bodies in there. And they were literally packing up to move away. 2 more bodies were found in there. And it was cold. It was absolutely freezing cold that winter. I relieved somebody who was standing there and stood outside there for a while. And there were people coming to that place at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. And it was pretty spooky is the word for it. I mean, I hadn't had any experience at that stage in my life with people of that ilk.
When they found the bodies, they realised that this was going to be quite an important case, and a remarkable one in many ways.
The extreme cold had meant that the 3 bodies in the coal cellar were in a good state of preservation and were able to provide pathologists with clues to exactly how they had died.
They had a pink coloration of their teeth. Now, the sign of carbon monoxide poisoning is that the blood looks pink.
This proved Christie had gassed his victims before he strangled them. And the presence of semen in the bodies gave the pathologists a strong clue to why he had rendered them unconscious before killing them.
At the time, it was said that because there were recognisable spermatozoa, that sexual intercourse had taken place at or about the time of death, in other words, just before, just afterwards.
The classic form of necrophilia is the act of having sex with an inanimate person. It doesn't always have to be dead per se. If, in fact, the person is drugged into a stupor beyond any form of consciousness, I would say if that's what they have to do to have sex with the victim, that would be a necrophile in my book.
With a cause and a time of death established, the hunt began to find the previous tenant of the flat.
And I always remember they put a big picture of him with his hat in his hand. And he got this bald head, and I said, well, if only they put his hat on his head, it might be more like him. And the next day, they put the hat on.
A lot of these big cases are arrested purely by chance. P.C. Ledger, down at Putney Bridge, sees a guy standing on the bridge, asks him to take his hat off, and he's caught Christie. We'd been looking for him for a week. Never seen hide nor hair of him. When they brought him in for the preliminary hearings at West London, I was asked to go down there and to sit with him in the cell while he waited to be heard. He was very quietly spoken. It was always said that he spoke quietly because he'd been gassed in the First World War. One wonders whether when he was under tension and stress, that his voice dropped down an octave and he spoke very quietly like that.
Faced with the charges, Christie pleaded insanity, blaming his wartime gas poisoning.
He always tried to claim that something came over him, it wasn't a conscious thing. I must have gone haywire. I saw this bit of rope by the chair. I pulled it round her. She was dead.
But this time his performance in the witness box failed to convince the jury. And on the 15th of July 1953, John Reginald Halliday Christie was hanged for murder. just 4 years earlier, another British serial killer stood before the gallows. The horrific way he disposed of his victims earned this killer the nickname of the acid bath murderer. It was a method he had perfected through scientific experiment.
While he was in prison, he managed to borrow empty jam jars from the kitchens. He used to fill each jam jar with a certain amount of sulphuric acid. Then he would drop a dead mouse into each of the jars to see how long it took a mouse to disintegrate in sulphuric acid, a formula that he knew he could eventually use on a human being.
In February 1948, the papers were full of the disappearance of a rich elderly widow. Olive Durand-Deacon had gone missing from the Onslow Court Hotel in London. The last person to see her alive was a much younger resident, John George Haigh.
He was a very smartly dressed, dapper little man, and a very quiet sort of person.
The police put a junior woman police sergeant onto the missing persons inquiry, and she set about interviewing all the guests at the Onslow Court Hotel. And of course that included Haigh as well. It was WPC Maud Lambourne who first became really suspicious about Haigh. She thought he was completely out of place living at the Onslow Court Hotel because it specialised in catering for elderly residents.
Her suspicions were quickly confirmed. Haigh had a police record for fraud.
He was involved in insurance fiddles. He posed as a garage owner on one occasion. He pretended he was a solicitor on another occasion. And he loved creating bogus companies.
But it was Haigh's links to a genuine company in Crawley, West Sussex, that proved his downfall.
The police telephoned the head of Horsham CID, Detective Sergeant Patrick Heslin, and they asked him to check for evidence that might link them to Mrs. Durand-Deacon, and they found nothing. But a few days later, on a Saturday morning, when Heslin was supposedly on his day off, by instinct he returned to Crawley to do some personal checking on his own. He went back to Hursley Products and asked the owner if he had any other premises in Crawley. And he said, yes, we do have some premises in Leopold Road in Crawley. John occasionally is allowed to use the workshop.
It's set well back from the road. Inside of that, of course, was where all the equipment concerned with the use of acid and various things like that.
Heslin found the acids, he found the rubber apron, and he found the gas mask and so on. But he had no idea what these things were for. He found dozens of documents in the names of people that the detectives have never heard of. More importantly, packed flat at the bottom of the box was a .38 Enfield revolver. So Heslin knew he was onto a major crime.
The 300-year-old courthouse of Horsham, Sussex, comes into the news as pressmen and sightseers await the arrival of a man charged with the alleged murder of a wealthy London widow. He is John Haigh.
Haigh now told the police exactly what had happened to the wealthy widow.
Haigh got to know Mrs. Durand-Deacon very well, won her confidence, discovered that she had £36,000 worth of stocks and shares tucked away. He persuaded her to enter into a business enterprise with him to manufacture plastic fingernails. Haigh drove her down to Crawley. They stopped briefly at the George Hotel and then went in early afternoon to the Leopold Road workshop, supposedly to have a look at some red cellophane paper that was going to be used in the manufacturing process. As she moved over to the bench, leant forward very slightly to look at the red cellophane paper, Haigh swiftly reached down to his hat box, pulled out his wartime revolver and shot her in the back of the head. He closed the workshop door, he walked up the Ifield Road into Crawley High Street, and he went to a little cafe called the Ancient Priors, and he sat down and he ordered poached egg on toast and a pot of tea.
Haigh had good reason to be so calm. He thought he had committed the perfect murder. No body would ever be found. An avid reader of law books, Haigh fancied himself as a legal expert.
He read a chapter on corpus delicti, which means body of the crime, and he thought naively that if there was no body, there could be no charge, there could be no court hearing, and therefore no conviction.
He was confident his scientific experiments with jam jars of acid and dead mice would pay off. His victim would be consumed by the acid. There would be no body to convict him.
I had a friend by the name of Davis that used to live further up the road and who was a welder. Davis actually told me himself that he was going up to London to get a couple of carboys of concentrated oil of vitriol, which is a very strong acid, for John to use in his work.
But what his colleagues in Crawley didn't know was that Haigh's work was murder.
For the next 2 hours, he put on his uniform, his gas mask, and he spent a long period pumping acid into the oil drum to get rid of Mrs. Durand-Deacon. He was totally convinced that if he could make a body disappear, then he couldn't be charged and he couldn't be prosecuted.
Elimination of a victim and elimination of evidence is basic to an organized offender. The victim becomes a prime piece of evidence. Although I would say that the destruction process here is kind of thorough and overboard, it's when you look at it realistically, it's an excellent way of destroying evidence. But at the same time, that does not necessarily preclude the fact that we might be dealing with a psychopath, an individual that kind of enjoys the killing process, kind of combining a little bit of pleasure with business, you might say.
But what makes a man like Haigh turn into a killer?
You have to go back to his childhood. You have to go back to understanding that this is a man who very likely developed the ability to live in separate compartments, to put people into separate compartments.
His parents were strictly religious, but they brought their son up in the teachings of the Plymouth Brethren. And this for Haigh meant no access to newspapers or radio. These were all banned from him because they were called instruments of the devil. His father used to say to him, if you sin, you will be punished by God. But then one day when he did carry out a minor infringement, he discovered that there was no retribution from God, and he realised that he could actually get away with things. So he began to think he was very special, that he'd been selected for some special purpose, and that he could literally do what he wanted.
My father, one Sunday morning, was reading the papers and he read that a Mrs. Durand-Deacon had disappeared, and the last person to see her was John George Haigh. And when he read that, he read it to Mother, and he said, he's killed this woman, he's killed Rose and Archie as well.
More detectives arrive on the scene, bringing cases in which to carry away their finds. As the search goes on, gruesome discoveries are brought to light. Sifting earth dug in the yard, detectives uncover what are thought to be human remains.
Haigh believed that destroying the body of Mrs. Durand-Deacon would make it impossible to convict him of murder. But he had made a mistake. Corpus delicti did not mean a physical body. It meant the body of evidence. No evidence, no conviction. All the police needed was evidence.
They called in the pathologist, Professor Keith Simpson. He knelt down in the corner of the yard and he began foraging in the soil. And within a few minutes, he picked out what looked like a large stone. He held the stone up to the detectives and he said, "This is a human gallstone."
Believing that the acid had destroyed all the body, Haigh had tipped the remaining sludge out into the yard. But the acid had not had time to finish its work.
They then started to look carefully. You see, the sludge had been looked at before and they found nothing. And so they did a sort of meticulous search of the sludge. And then they got out Mrs. Durand-Deacon's foot, and this fitted her shoe.
The acid sludge still had one more clue to give up: a pair of false teeth.
It was actually made out of acrylic, perspex type material. The thing about it was that it wasn't immediately destructible, even in concentrated sulfuric acid.
Mrs. Durand-Deacon's dentist was traced, and she confirmed the teeth had belonged to her patient. Today, identifying murder victims by their teeth is commonplace, but in the 1940s, it was groundbreaking forensics.
It certainly wasn't a common event to start using dentistry. And the trick of somebody like Professor Keith Simpson was that his mindset was so switched on that he would use every available new method. And I have to say that given the disastrous condition of the small amount of remains found, that I doubt if, even with all the technology we've got, all the electron microscopy, the biochemistry and so on, I doubt if we could have actually come up with a better solution than Keith Simpson and his police team did then.
He went down there to see if he could find a body, and he did find enough of the body to identify Mrs. Durand-Deacon.
By March, the newspaper headlines were full of the acid bath murders. Haigh, still convinced that without a body he could not be convicted of murder, confidently confessed to 5 more killings.
Haigh's first victim was William McSwan, who was his good friend that he had actually worked with.
William McSwan met Haigh in a West London arcade, one of a number owned by McSwan's parents.
The McSwans had sold their pinball business and they'd invested all their money into 6 properties dotted around West London. And as soon as Haigh heard about these 6 properties, he wanted to get his hands on those properties.
Haigh invited William McSwan back to his London workshop, a basement in Kensington.
Within a few minutes of arriving in the basement, Haigh had got hold of an iron bar and smashed him twice across the back of the skull and killed him within a few minutes.
Haigh now immersed his first human body in a drum of acid.
In order to get sufficient quantities of acid for the first killing, Haigh set up a bogus company called Union Group Engineering. He sent orders to a firm in East London asking for 10 gallons of sulfuric acid. And within a few days, the acid was delivered to the Gloucester Road basement without any questions asked. He knew that it was dangerous stuff, so he had to get himself some equipment to wear. The acid destroyed McSwan's body completely and turned the liquid in the drum into a black, slimy sludge, which Haigh disposed of through a drain in the middle of the floor.
Haigh now forged papers to transfer the ownership of McSwan's properties to him. But he was shocked to discover they were still owned by McSwan's parents, so they too had to die.
In September 1945, when most of the country was celebrating the end of the Second World War, Haigh was inviting the McSwan parents down to his basement in the Gloucester Road.
Haigh killed both McSwans with an iron bar. He disposed of their bodies using his unique killing signature, placing the bodies into drums of acid. Later, their remains were also tipped away down the drain.
Haigh sold all the McSwan properties for cash, and he raised something like £4,000 or £5,000, which was quite a lot of money in 1945, and had a very pleasant life with their money. He lived at the Onslow Court Hotel in London for quite a period. He would always have Savile Row suits. He bought himself a brand new car.
He had a Lagonda, I think it was a Lagonda Rapide actually, which is quite a raunchy motor car, and quite a motor car, I can assure you.
He had a real ambition to become a successful inventor, and so he spent a lot of his ill-gotten money on inventions, like an electric car for children, which he tried to market. None of his projects were financially successful.
So it didn't take Haigh long to work his way through all of the McSwan money.
By the time we reached the year 1948, he was in the red at National Bank in Kensington. So he went back to the acid bath to get some more money.
His next victims were Archie and Rose Henderson, a successful doctor and his society wife, who, like the McSwans, had properties they were trying to sell.
I remember that when they'd met Haigh, Rose and Archie were meeting Mum and Dad for lunch. And they were late. And when they arrived, Rose was gushing. She said, "I've met this wonderful man. You've got to meet him, Arnold. He's told me I'm not asking enough for the business. I should ask for another £5,000 and he's going to pay me." My father's first reaction to that was, the man's obviously either a fool or crazy. If I was you, I'd run a mile.
She didn't listen to her brother's advice, and soon the Hendersons and Haigh were inseparable.
The Hendersons were staying for a holiday down at the Metropole Hotel in Brighton. Haigh visited the hotel, had coffee with Henderson, and then drove him up to Crawley. They had lunch together in a country club, and straight after lunch, Haigh led Henderson to his little workshop in Leopold Road in Crawley.
Haigh shot Archie with Archie's own gun, apparently.
It was his captain's pistol that he had at his home in West London. Haigh had stolen it and used it to kill him.
With Archie dead, only Rose stood in the way of Haigh's plan to steal their fortune.
He then went back to Brighton to tell Rose that Archie was seriously ill and was in hospital, and he'd come to take her to Crawley.
Haigh said to her, "I want to go to my workshop first to collect Archie's coat. Will you come with me?" She walked into the workshop, and within a few minutes she was shot in the back of the head with the same gun. And on that evening there were 2 brand new oil drums standing in the Leopold Road workshop, with husband and wife packed tight inside them.
The first my father heard of Rose and Archie's problems was when Haigh contacted him and said, Archie, whilst performing an abortion, has killed a patient. He's in trouble with the police are after him, and he and Rose have left, and I've got a letter here, and I'm sending it to you. The letter said that Haigh had given them some money, and with that they had given him power of attorney over all their houses and businesses, etc., property. My father never doubted that letter was genuine. That was the amazing thing. And it later transpired that Rose used to write to Haigh from time to time, because Rose was a great letter writer. And because he'd had those letters, he was able to get into Rose's way of writing a letter.
The man was a skilled fraudster. He spent his time observing people. He had learned to know what it is that makes them tick, what it is that gets him where he wants to be with them. By the time Haigh killed the Hendersons, he was certainly a practiced killer. It simply is a matter of expediency. He's in a position now where he can do it. He's used to doing it. He has the means of disposal. It's easier in some ways to kill them than to not kill them.
Despite the discovery of Archie Henderson's gun in Haigh's workshop, no physical trace of either the doctor or his wife was ever found. A similar search of Haigh's Kensington basement for the McSwan family also proved fruitless. It seemed Haigh had been partly right. No trace of a body, no conviction.
There was never any forensic evidence to link him with murders, only his confession.
Confronted with enough forensic evidence to hang for the murder of Mrs. Durand-Deacon, Haigh attempted a plea of insanity, claiming that he had drunk the blood of his victims.
Everything that we know about Haigh before the claim that he drank his victim's blood argues against him wanting that sort of contact. This is a man who clothed himself in all sorts of protective clothing in order to reduce his contact, certainly with the acid, but also with the victims.
And it appears Haigh was preparing for more victims. Among his papers, the police discovered the plan for a new, more durable acid bath.
Davis had some big sheet metal plates he was trying to weld together, so he said, Ron, hang on while I tack all these corners. Well, he tacked all these corners. He then informed me that he had to coat it with an acid-proof paint, and it was for old John Haigh.
When you see the increasing complexity in the design of the bath system for disposing of the bodies, I think that is the one area where you see something that goes beyond the purely utilitarian reason for the murders. Remember, the man saw himself as an inventor.
John had learnt from experience that the drum could only be used once or so he thought then that he would have a proper box made with acid-proof paint.
That alone was expensive, and it suggested that he was going to reuse that drum on another occasions.
He would have been then moving on to kill people, not just because of what they might bring to him, but to make sure that his system was properly working, properly tested, and so on. Again, the heart of it is the inability to see other people as anything more than a vehicle for what it is that he wants.
A guilty verdict was never in doubt. Haigh was convicted of murder and sentenced to death.
Haigh made no reaction when he heard the verdict. He stood in the dock for a few seconds, was then led away down the steps to the cells, and his first words were, "It's no good crying over spilt milk." I was expecting that decision.
John George Haigh was hanged at Wandsworth Prison in August 1949. It would be 10 years before Britain would have to face another set of serial killings, and this time they were perpetrated by a couple.
A book to accompany this major ITV series is available from all good retailers. Now, tomorrow night here on Carlton, we reveal some of the dirty secrets lurking in the kitchens of Britain's restaurants that will leave diners well and truly disgusted. Restaurants from Hell 2002, here tomorrow night at 9 o'clock.